Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask our guests here in-house if you'll be so kind to have a courtesy check that your cell phones have been silenced. That's always appreciated. And, of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage following the presentations today for your future reference. Hosting our discussion will be Jennifer Marshall, who is Vice President for our Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity. She oversees research into a variety of issues that determine the strength and character of American society. Before joining us here, she worked on cultural policy issues at Empower America, and before that, she was a Senior Director of Family Studies at the Family Research Council. She also has practical experience, having taught in France at the American School in Lyon. Of particular importance, however, Jennifer is also the Joseph C. and Elizabeth Anderlich Fellow, and it's a rare occasion at Heritage that we get to have the namesake of one of our fellowships here and joining us, and we're pleased to recognize Betty Anderlich and her family, who are sitting here among us, and we welcome you to Heritage, and so glad you could join us on this occasion, and I believe spent the day with us yesterday too, just to see what we're up to. Thank you again for joining us. Jennifer, the program's yours.
Good morning. Thank you, John, and again, thank you, Betty, for being here. It's our great pleasure to be able to highlight a family who really underscores the reasons for which we exist as an Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity at the Heritage Foundation, and the reason we have created this Index of Culture and Opportunity. So often, the conversation about opportunity begins with economics and just stays there. And of course, it's important that we have a thriving economy, that we make sure we have job openings for people to take. But we know that the conversation about opportunity involves much more than that. And it has a lot to do with family and relationships and community and that support system that allows individuals to grab hold of educational and economic opportunity. And the Anderlich family has really, in so many ways, supported all of those community efforts. We're grateful to be the beneficiaries of that as well. So thank you for being here today, Betty. And we have dedicated the Index of Culture and Opportunity this year to the Anderlichs, and you'll see that dedication in the front of your volume as you walk out here. Well, it's also my honor to introduce to you today Senator Jeff Sessions to kick off our program. Senator Sessions has represented the state of Alabama in the United States Senate since 1997. Prior to that, he was Attorney General for the state and was a United States Attorney nominated to that post by President Ronald Reagan. Senator Sessions is a father, a grandfather. He is active in his church. He is a senior member on the Senate Budget Committee, and in that role, he has set a very fine example for all of us, looking past the numbers, past the dollars, to the human beings that are the center of any policy question. And we've been particularly moved by how he has done that on the subject of poverty, talking about human capacity and the moral problem when we do not diagnose the problems correctly, and therefore we end up with the wrong solutions that do not do justice to human dignity. We are thankful for his leadership to paint the way back, to lead the way back to proper policy solutions, and we thought he was just the right person to kick off our event here today about the Index of Culture and Opportunity. Will you please join me in welcoming Senator Sessions?
Thank you, Jennifer. It's so good to be with you and to celebrate the very important report, this Index of Culture and Opportunity. I think opportunity is a good word because we can get negative when we talking about American culture, and there are things to be concerned about, and I am concerned about them, but there are opportunities out there too. I know, Jennifer, your colleagues, Rachel Sheffield and Christine Kim, wrote a piece, an op-ed, and I immediately called because I liked what they were saying about this report and what we need to do about the future of America. And I want to learn more about it and get more engaged in it. There are not enough hours in the day for us, but it absolutely has to be found time to focus on what we can do about our culture, our people, the quality of their life. Are they self-sufficient? Are they growing more dependent? Are they healthy emotionally, spiritually, economically? or not. And if we have bad trends going on into the country, we need to ask ourselves, is something happening that's not good? Are there things the government can do to change this? A lot of this is sometimes very difficult for government to deal with, but I think there are things that your government can do that spends trillions of dollars each year, and we need to spend that money wisely and not ignore culture. As Rachel and Christine said in their op-ed, a thriving society needs a strong economy. The reverse is just as true. A healthy economy is built on a vibrant culture that promotes individual and social well-being. That is absolutely true. And matter of fact, this culture is so important to us. I remember when we were having the debate over immigration, National Review wrote an editorial that touched me, and I have quoted a lot of times. It said, "We are a nation with an economy, not an economy with a nation. We are people first and foremost." The overall goal of this country is not just economic growth, although that's exceedingly important. We need to have personal growth, personal development, healthy families, happy people. So I just think that this is true, and we need to work on it. And that one of the things I've learned is that government isn't always the answer, at least the Washington part of it. I get asked back home, especially by church people, they say they're praying for me and they want me to fix it. And I used to say, well, we need more and bigger churches and more people raised to do the right thing, more and more people that have a work ethic and so forth, and that's your job. But they don't like to hear that, so I quit saying that because they just like me to fix it. But there is a sense in which, in a democracy like ours, people get what they want. And if they are looking for something for nothing and they're not principally in tune with the heritage of the United States of America, then we're not going to get the kind of results, I think, in the ballot box that we'd like to have. It's just that deep. And so I think culture is important. And we've got some great positive events that are occurring in my lifetime. My neighbor, you young people don't know the importance of the phrase running water, but a lot of people didn't have running water. You have running water, they like to know. Even in my lifetime, my next door neighbor, the doctor from LSU and Auburn engineer and daughter Auburn graduate and healthcare magnate almost. Well, they had an outdoor toilet when I was young. So I don't know what it is. Bob Woodson, you said something recently, or actually Jim DeMint quoted you in his preface to this book as saying, culture molds our capacity to grab hold of opportunity. Do we have the capacity to see the opportunity and grasp it? And also, culture shapes our ability to overcome adversity. And you said that at our budget committee hearing. We had this wonderful Hispanic young lady, who testified. The Democrats had called, and she talked about, I think it was Pell Grants that had helped her go to college, and she was most proud of it. And Bob looked at her and said, that opportunity, you took it. The question is, are we doing enough to make sure that people grasp the opportunities? And this is cultural in so many ways, I think. And work is essential. Was Ecclesiastes say it's all is vanity, just toil, toil, toil? I mean, what else is there out there? What else, when you're confused, just go to work. At least do that. Well, we're getting away from that ethic. And one of the worst things my good friend George Bush said, bless his heart, that jobs Americans won't do. And that is a wrong thing to say. We should respect. My mama taught me to respect people who went to work. And you'd see somebody out here working hard, and she'd say, he's taking care of his family. And the worst thing you could say is that guy ran off and left all his children. That was a bad thing to do when I was a kid. And we're not into that enough. And I think those things are key. And how we do overcome in human ways, humanly, the difficulties we face, and are we teaching the kind of resilience and character and determination and work ethic that we need to teach? And are our government programs too often undermining those characteristics? There's a guy, I can't remember his name now, communitarian in approach, he called it. And he talked about the first 150 years of the American Republic. You study the debate in the Congress, and he was focused on, will our laws make people better or not? Will it create bad habits? Will it create expectations that we should not create? Would it undermine self-sufficiency? To show you how self-sufficiency has gotten befuddled, last week we had an immigration hearing on refugees, and the Department of Health and Human Services official proudly declared that after 180 days, 75% of refugees are self-sufficient. Sounded good, except one of my brilliant staff people handed me a note, and I pressed him on it. Self-sufficiency to him meant they no longer got refugee money. But immediately upon entering the country, all refugees are entitled to every government program: food stamps, Medicaid, TANF, housing allowances, and those kind of things. They weren't counting that when he said they were self-sufficient. So I would just suggest maybe one of the indexes, Jennifer, is the degradation of language. Maybe we ought to study the degradation of language. Well, and marriage, how do you get out of poverty? Get married. That's one thing. The data shows you live longer, you're happier, you commit suicide less often, go to jail less often, and have a happier sex life if you're married. I mean, what's wrong with this? Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a great senator, and I served with him for a time, and I saw him in the subway one time. There was something positive about marriage that popped up in the news, and I asked him, did he see that and what he thought, and he just like that. He said, the world has never seen a nation go through the collapse of marriage like we're seeing in America. Very passionate, very intense answer. And I do think that we are at a point in time where we need to consider that. Your report talks about the rate of marriage continues to decline, although we have a decline in divorce a little bit. 1 in 4 children lived in single-parent households. The overall rate of non-marital births is at an all-time high. Teen drug use is up. By the way, drug use is surging in this country. And President Obama is saying it's not much different than smoking a cigarette. To smoke marijuana was a terrible, terrible thing. And I spent years in the first years of the Reagan administration promoting a concept that drug use for young people is bad. And I remember distinctly the University of Michigan study said 50% of high school seniors in 1980 admitted using an illegal drug that year. A new statistic, and it dropped to under 25%. We cut it in half, more than half. Now I saw a number that 50% admit, 49% acknowledge using an illegal drug. 120 people a day die from drug overdose. These are societal numbers that are going to come back and bite us. The idea that we can just look the other way to drug use, that it's not addictive, that does not destroy people, does not end up destroying families is totally false. And we need to, as a nation, from the top person on down, resist that because it's the quality of our people at stake, the quality of our lives at stake. So I just appreciate what you're doing. You're going to have a great panel today. We'll be following it. I've got another agenda that I have to attend, or I would stay for it. So to wrap up, let me just thank you for this fine report. It surely touches on the most important issues, I think, facing our nation and our culture. A culture that we are blessed to have received and did not create. Change is constant, and most of it's good. Still, there is danger in rapid change. Core values that are our heritage, that have served us and much of the world, must be preserved. Strong character in our people is essential for a healthy democracy, and that's what this index causes us to think upon. Thank you, and good luck and for the great work you're doing.
Well, that was terrific. Thank you, Senator, for those remarks. They particularly underscored something we have tried to highlight with the Index of Culture and Opportunity, and that is that it is going to take both right policy and the strong efforts of civil society actors to get our country on the right track. In terms of culture and opportunity. We're going to have two panels speaking today, bringing together several of the contributors to the 2015 Index of Culture and Opportunity. And before I introduce the first of those panels, I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to give you a quick overview of the index itself. We have brought together here a set of indicators that, as I mentioned, looks at cultural dynamics, poverty and dependency, and economic factors like the direction of unemployment and so on. And we take a look at whether the most recent data for this, over the last 10-year period for which data is available on each of 31 indicators, whether the data is headed in the right direction or the wrong direction in terms of opening the doors of opportunity. And I wanted to give you just a quick look at that. Let me get the clicker here so I can do that. And to show you how this is formatted. You see here the culture indicators, the first third of our 31 indicators, looking at things like the marriage rate, divorce rate, teen drug use, which the Senator mentioned, the abortion rate. And then we have the right direction or the wrong direction for the last 10 years. We did a 10-year window because we don't want to just look at the most recent data point. Culture changes slowly but surely. And so we wanted to look at that window over a decade's time. One of the things that was interesting that we began to hypothesize last year, and we'll keep looking at it, is that it does take efforts of both policy and civil society to get indicators headed on the right direction. One of the reasons that we've seen some improvement on the divorce rate over time is there have been efforts at divorce reform in policy at the state, surely not enough, but they're beginnings of that conversation. And we've had a lot more data come out about the significance of divorce for children and for men and women and their financial and overall well-being. So these are the kinds of conversations that can change and begin to highlight the need for change in cultural indicators. The next set of indicators is poverty and dependence, and of course we're looking there at food stamp participation, and that has skyrocketed in recent years. Thankfully, the participation in the cash welfare program has continued to decline. We're glad for that. We think more could be done in that area in the TANF program. And then the final area are general opportunity indicators. And here we have quite a few education indicators, which are thankfully some of those that are headed in the right direction. And Lindsay and Anna will be telling us about those on our final panel here today. This is what the Index of Culture and Opportunity is about, and you'll be able to take a copy on your departure here today. We intend to do this annually, and one of the things that makes the index a very useful and user-friendly product are the contributors. We have 21 contributors this year to the index, and we're so pleased to have 3 of them here with us today. The set of contributors who wrote commentaries on the indicators this year include academics here at Heritage, scholars at other think tanks, scholars at universities across the country, practitioners, journalists. We're really pleased with the group of individuals that was willing to contribute commentary to help us understand these trends and to diagnose what's at the root of the problem and what are the sound solutions that can help us overcome it. That's the conversation we want to have here today on our next two panels. The significance of identifying the problem correctly, getting that diagnosis right, so that we build the right solutions as well. If we get the diagnosis wrong, and so much of liberal policy making over the last half century has done exactly that, it has gotten the nature of the problem wrong, we are going to end up with the wrong solutions. I'm really pleased that on our first panel here, we will have Yuval Levin, who is the Hertog Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, helping us to discuss this issue. He is also the editor of National Affairs, which is a must-read journal for conservatives who are interested in sound policy solutions and thoughtful reflection on the problems of the day. The image that you see on the cover of this year's index highlights the intergenerational nature of our challenges. And we owe that image to a metaphor and a discussion that Yuval had in his introduction to this year's Index of Culture and Opportunity. I'll let him explain that more as he has a conversation with David Azerrad, who is the director of our B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics here at the Heritage Foundation. And I think you'll find their conversation very interesting. So David and Yuval, over to you.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome back, Yuval. We were here, I think, about 2 years ago when you wrote your book on Burke and Payne, and Heritage had the pleasure of hosting you for you to present it. So as Jennifer mentioned, in the introduction that you wrote, the very nice introduction you wrote to the index, one of the things you argue is that if we're going to diagnose the problem, we need to rethink our understanding of society. And you proceed to very nicely lay out a richer, deeper, more robust way of thinking of society that is, I think, different than the one most of us would probably instinctively produce where we put on the spot. Could you flesh out for the audience a little bit what you mean by this intergenerational compact?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you to Heritage for doing this. It's an incredible public service and really an extraordinary achievement, this index. As Jennifer said, I think the first step you have to take before you can even think about what it is you need to measure in an index like this is to think about the fundamental question of diagnosis. What should we be looking for? How do we tell if we're doing well or doing poorly? What are the questions we need to ask? And to get there, you do need a sense of what it is society actually consists of. What are we looking at? What does a healthy society mean, and what would an unhealthy society mean? The problem we have in our politics is very frequently that deep. We get the answer to that question wrong. And a lot of times our political debates seem as though they are working from an idea of society that consists of individuals and a government. That's society. And in fact, when you think about what society is and how people thrive and how people flourish, most of what society consists of actually happens in the space between those two, between individuals and a government. It is not just a collection of individuals, and it is not just a story about a national government leading one whole nation in one single direction. Society happens in the spaces in between, and what fills those spaces are families, our communities, our civic organizations, our churches, our schools, the things we actually do together at an interpersonal level, rather than at a very abstract national level. And it's in those places where the difference between thriving and failing actually happens. It's in those places where the difference between a successful life and the kinds of failures of opportunities that too many Americans face now are determined. And an index that looks at culture and opportunity has to look at those spaces. Our politics very rarely looks at those spaces. And really, a lot of what happens in those spaces, and I love this cover, as Jennifer was suggesting, this really is to me a picture of what society involves. It is an intergenerational compact. It is a way in which the young and the old, and by the way, those who are not yet born and those who have passed away, who have left us this society, work together to make the most of what our kind of free society can offer us. Our political debates are almost never about that. They're about a kind of balance of payments. They're about redistribution. They're about who gets what amount of money from what. Those things are important. They're not irrelevant. But to get to even asking the right questions about where money should flow, we need to first understand how people actually thrive and how people actually fail. And, you know, if you ask why our politics isn't getting at these problems correctly, I think first and foremost, it doesn't ask these questions.
I would even go further than you and say, I think many conservatives don't get it that way. I agree with what you say, but you don't sound mainstream conservative.
Uh-huh.
You didn't talk about rights, you didn't talk about liberty. It's not a language that is congenial, I think, to mainstream American conservatives, although I think the practice very much is.
Yeah. I think that that way of understanding society undergirds mainstream conservatism, right? What we think of as conservatism, the defense of individual rights, the defense of liberty, including economic liberty, is in fact unimaginable and incoherent in any other way of thinking about society except this way that we're getting at here. So conservatism often takes that for granted, and it's not something we should take for granted. It's the last thing we should take for granted. But I don't think that it's necessarily in tension with the way that conservatives tend to talk about liberty and about economics and about culture. It undergirds it. It's the essential prerequisite for what we take to be freedom in American life. And we have to think about that prerequisite because right now it's that precondition, that prerequisite, that's most under threat. And so the question isn't, is government playing too big a role? Is it taking too much? Is it doing too much? The question is, are people able to flourish in America? And the answer to that is not just about whether government's too big or too small. The answer to that right now is about the absence of the institutions that fill that space between the individual and the state. And you're right, conservatives don't think enough about that. We take it for granted, we assume it, and we have to articulate it and then look at society and see that that's where work is needed, is in those spaces.
In reading your essay, I noticed that there's a strange parallelism between the left and the right, that we tend to distrust government and trust civil society and markets, and liberals tend to distrust civil society and markets and trust the government. Is this correct, and how do you account for it? What is it about the liberal and conservative temperaments or dispositions or worldviews that leads them to...
Yeah. You know, I think part of it does run very deep. One of the big differences between left and right has to do with a basic disposition about the given world. You look at the world, some things about it are working well, some things about it are working poorly. Which of those strikes you first? Are you first struck by what's failing and outraged by it because your expectations are very high? Or are you first struck by what works and you try to build on that and be grateful for it and see how you can address problems by starting with what is going well and building towards what isn't. I think conservatives, because we have lower expectations, frankly, because we start from an idea of the human person as a fallen creature, as an imperfect creature, always, all of us are prone to vice and to sin. We are impressed by what's working before we're outraged by what's failing. Because frankly, the fact that anything works in a complex society like this is pretty amazing. And so we have problems. Let's build on things that are going well. I think people on the left, frankly, in part because they have higher expectations of the individual, because they think human beings can be much more than they've ever been. There's a sense of this possibility of perfectibility, especially with the right kind of government, the right kinds of institutions. They're first and foremost outraged by failure, and they want to throw it away and start over. I think that's a mistake because we just can't possibly expect to be able to start over in the right way. Again, we have to build on what's working. And so that does mean that conservatives have much more trust and faith and belief in the established traditional institutions of society, in the family, in the church, in the community, because these are institutions that have made human flourishing possible for generation after generation. And so if you look at a society where there's not enough flourishing, you have to ask yourself, are those institutions that have worked for us now failing? Rather than saying, how do we throw all this out, get just the right balance and just the right people in government to get it to work, and then we'll make it happen. It's very implausible. And I think it starts from an understanding of the human person and human society that's also implausible. The nature of a lot of our political debates hides that from us. We talk about technical questions. We talk about how to get just the right incentives here and there, and all that's important. But what are the assumptions we're making about how society works underneath that? I think the technical way of having policy debates hides a lot of those distinctions from us and keeps us from seeing that ultimately the question is, are the fundamental institutions of our society working? And those are not places where individuals are on their own, and they're not places where government makes every decision. They're places where we actually work together at an interpersonal level with other human beings, at the level of the human person. That's where flourishing happens, and the failure of that is the failure of society.
So would you say that there's something a little bit off about this dependency language, that it somehow implies that
Yeah.
we can be independent, whereas, I mean, to be human is to depend on others, and the question is then, who do you depend on?
Yeah. I absolutely do think that, and I think conservatives incline to the language of dependency in a way that that keeps us from seeing some human realities. Dependence is the human condition, right? Independence is not a human possibility. Everybody
you're a
depends
sociopath.
on... Yeah, unless you're a sociopath. And then you're just imagine it's a possibility,
Yeah.
right? You're still wrong. Everybody depends on others. No one is self-sufficient. There's no such thing. The question is, does the dependence, the web of dependence that you're a part of, involve reciprocal responsibility? Does it demand something from you? Does it call on you to be a fuller human person? Or does it just give you something and say good luck? The difference between those two has a lot to do with the kinds of social debates we have. Because if you just, in a neutral way, give somebody resources and say good luck, as a lot of our public programs do, exactly to avoid trying to weigh people down with moral expectations and all this and that, it does derive from an idea of freedom, but I think that it's a very shallow and misguided idea of freedom. In fact, what people require to be free is reciprocal responsibility. You can only be free when you understand what's expected, when you direct your own sense of right and wrong in a way that somehow aligns with what is in fact right and wrong. And to get there requires a lot of moral formation, requires exactly the kinds of institutions that we're talking about here: the family, community, civil society, religion. To get to a place from where we as human beings enter the world, and if you're a parent, you know what I mean, to get from there to civilized human beings who are capable of exercising freedom requires a lot more than liberty. It requires society, and it requires an idea of society that is not just about giving money to individuals so no one's poor. That's good. But in order to make sure that in fact we have a rich and thriving society, we have to understand what the purpose of society is, what the structure of society is. And again, too often the kinds of political debates we have are rooted in a failure to see that.
So you're selling something pretty unappealing. On the one hand, you're telling us human beings are fallen, sinful, we should have low expectations.
Right.
And on the other hand, you're saying, and they should have all these responsibilities.
Yes.
And the left is saying...
To me, the definition of conservatism is low expectations and high standards.
Yeah.
And that's tough, but, too bad. That human flourishing is tough.
Yeah.
The fact is we have a country that's capable of it, and we need to demand it.
One of the things that we keep on coming back to in this index, in our debates, that you come back to in this essay and some other very nice essays you've written recently, including one in First Things, is the family. It seems that it is kind of ground zero for the culture wars. What is it about the family that is so important to the right and that is, in a sense, so problematic for the left?
I think the family is where it is truly impossible to believe in radical individualism. Is where the family is proof that a radically individualist idea of liberty is false. And that's why it's such a challenge to a certain kind of social liberalism. And it's also why it's absolutely central to a certain kind of social conservatism. I think the family is where we begin that journey from the savage that enters the world to a civilized person. And that first step is by far the most important step because it prepares you for all the others. It's very important to talk about education. It's very important to talk about work opportunities and all the rest of it. We can't flourish without those. But we can't use those without the foundation that only families provide. And ultimately, that first step is where the critical difference becomes apparent. And if you don't believe in the necessity of moral formation for freedom, then the family looks to you like oppression. It looks to you like a bunch of people telling each other what to do. But if you do believe in the need for that kind of moral formation, then the family is the absolutely essential precondition for flourishing and for freedom. And, that is a difference you find in our public debates, no question about it.
So if we turn to the role of government, you've touched upon this. How do we think about it? What exactly is government's role in sustaining civil society? How should it interact with civil society? There's a tendency sometimes on the right to say, let's blow up the government, run away, and civil society will take care of everything, and spontaneous order will emerge, and we don't need to do anything.
Yeah. It's a very important question, and it's especially so because of the damage that's been done to civil society over the last really century of how we've thought about government. That's one major reason for not thinking that, for not believing that if you just leave civil society alone, it'll thrive. We have spent a century now pulling at civil society from above and below through centralized government and through radical individualism. And the fact is, it's not simply in shape to thrive. It does require reviving. It does require revitalization. That's not the work of government, though. It seems to me that if you think about society as taking place largely in that space between the individual and the state, the core role of the state, of the national government, is to protect that space and to sustain that space. It's an extremely important role. The federal government has a very important role, and conservatives should always make sure we see the importance of that role. We talk a lot about the Constitution. We talk about it as though it just sets out individual liberties. The Constitution created the federal government. And if we respect the Constitution, we ought to find a way to respect the federal government. But to do that, we have to make it respectable. And to make it respectable, we have to remind it of its proper role. And its role is to protect and to sustain that space in which society happens. To make sure that it's protected literally from outside, from threats. To make sure that what happens in it is protected from the sorts of mistreatment of individuals that always happens in any human society. Law and order is essential. And it also has a role in making sure that people have access to what happens in civil society, to trying to help us find ways to enable people to benefit from what our society does. And that does involve some assistance to people who are in destitution. There is a role for government in enabling an education system to work. There are roles, but the role is a supporting role. It is not the leading role. The role is always to make sure that society can flourish and thrive. And society flourishes and thrives from the bottom up, not from the top down. So to me, it's a matter of building space, not of filling the space. And too often what our federal government does is try to fill that space, is try to clear out all those institutions that stand between the individual and the state and say, we can do this better. We can't do it better. That's why we have those institutions. That's why they've evolved the way they have over many, many generations of living in a free society. And our federal government should exist to shield them, to protect the space in which they can thrive, rather than to try to replace them.
And that's a different way of looking at the debate than the way it's usually occurs in the public square, where Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren lay down a marker of 900 billion,
Right.
and then we need to fight saying, no, we only want 700 billion or 600 billion.
Yeah, I mean, in this sense, what I'm suggesting is a much more radical conservatism than
Yeah.
what we normally find, right? Because if you just look at the left-right debate of the last few years, if you step back and look at it, you could easily be forgiven for thinking that the argument is about how much we should spend on the liberal welfare state, right? Should it be this expensive or that expensive? The argument is really about the role of government in a flourishing free society. And a lot of what conservatives propose and want to do is about that, right? It's about enabling bottom-up flourishing. It's about allowing society to make it possible for families to make choices for themselves, to make it possible for the institutions that stand between the individual and the state to thrive. That's what conservatives actually want to do. That's what school choice is, for example, as opposed to a centralized school system. That's what thinking about welfare in terms of allowing flexibility for local institutions to help individuals at their own interpersonal level means, as opposed to a centralized welfare system. It's what conservatives want to do on the full range of policy ideas, if you think about it. But it's not how we tend to talk. We tend to talk about ways of saving money, about ways of being more efficient. I do think all these ideas would be less costly than a government that tries to do the impossible. But what's most important about them, what's most different about them, is that they operate from a different understanding of human flourishing. It's not just about money. And, you know, conservatives forget that too often. We let ourselves get dragged into a debate about how much we want to spend on the wrong way of thinking about society.
Yeah.
There's no amount you could spend on it that would be the right amount. We need to change the way we think about what government is for.
Before we open it up to questions, what worries you most about some of these cultural trends, and what gives you the most hope?
You know, I think the greatest worry is what's happening at the very core of that intergenerational compact, at the actual junction of the generations. The biggest worry for me is out of wedlock childbearing, which is certainly the biggest social problem we have. It has grown in a way that should terrify us, and it's the biggest problem because it is that first step on the path to flourishing. It means that too many Americans are denied the kind of family that is most likely to make for flourishing. And it's most likely, don't get me wrong, a lot of single parents allow their children to have flourishing lives. It's just that they have to do the impossible to make that happen. They do it. A lot of mothers do what to anyone outside that family should look impossible. I mean, look, if I have to spend one night without my wife with the kids, I immediately learn that it is practically impossible to raise a child on your own. To think of having to do that on your own, of having the responsibility to get that person started out without a father, is just about the most horrible thing going on in our society. And I think that's the worst trend, and it continues to get worse. So that's a reason for worry and for pessimism. There are other things going on in our society that should give us some hope. I think that there are innovative ideas in education now, and we'll hear about those. A lot of those are coming from here that should give us a lot of hope and that allow people who start out with enormous disadvantage to have more of a chance to succeed. There are things going on at the level of civil society in dealing with poverty, in dealing with brokenness. Bob Woodson is here. He's been working to make this happen for decades, and the successes that he has had should give us all hope and should be a model for a lot of people. I think life in America is always getting better and worse at the same time. That's in a way the biggest challenge for people who want to think about society, because you always want to be, you either want to be able to say we're on the right path, great, or things are horrible, let's turn it around and start over. The fact is, those are both true almost always. And the challenge we have is to learn from what's going well in order to deal with what isn't. I think there's a lot to learn from now, but there's also a lot to fix and a lot to think about.
We can take questions from the audience. I don't know if there are microphones. If you want to raise your hand, we have about 10 minutes. Identify yourself and. Mike?
Senator Sessions talked about the conversations he has with religious institutions in his own community. We talk about the problems with the federal government imposing its will on civil society. But is there any truth to the fact that maybe civil society hasn't stepped up to the plate at the same time in the last couple of decades? And what are you seeing, or what can be done at that level to contribute to the discussion?
Yeah, I think there is truth to that. Some of it is a function of the federal government filling space that ought to be filled by civil society, and so it bears some responsibility. Some of it, though, is, I think, I think there's a way in which social conservatism, religious conservatism in America has failed to step up. Social conservatism and religion in a free society does two sorts of things for us. We can think of them in terms of justice and order. Justice means stepping up for the weakest, defending them from the strong. It means making sure that people who are in positions of disadvantage are helped. And American social conservatism does an enormous amount of that. It has a lot to be proud of. In the pro-life movement, in helping the poor at home and abroad, there's an enormous amount of that going on, and it's thriving, and it's growing, and it's very impressive. Order, the other side of what social conservatism or religion does for us, is more difficult. That's less about protecting the weak from the strong in society. That's about allowing people to overcome their own weakness and their own vices and to overcome disorder in their own lives. It's a very important part of what religion does for a free society, of what social conservatism has always done for America. We can think of justice and order in terms of slavery and abolition, right? The fight for justice is the harder fight. But it is the fight we're fighting, and we have a lot to be proud of there. The fight for order, we've really let go. And I think that social conservatives, religious conservatives in our country, in the last few decades have spent much more of their attention on the justice questions than the order questions. We talk less about self-improvement. We talk less about fighting vice. We talk less about living ordered lives. And it shows. The fact is there's no other way to help people in the most truly desperate situations than ultimately to show them that what's required of them by the highest truths that we know is that they be better people. And it's a challenge for all of us, for every single one of us, all the time. And it's a challenge that religion in a free society steps up to allow us to deal with. I think, and I say this about my own religion, and I say it with greater trepidation about others, that we do less of this than we should, and less of this than we used to. And that we talk much more about where religion can step in to protect the weakest, but we talk too little about where religion should step in to protect us from ourselves, to help us order ourselves, to help us fight vice and disorder. A lot of the social problems we have are actually founded in that problem, in a kind of personal and interpersonal disorder that we should expect more from our civil and religious institutions, more guidance, more help, more direction, more focus and emphasis. That's what those groups that Bob Woodson works with really do. They step in and allow people to find ways to reorder their own lives. I don't think we do nearly enough of that.
Cooper?
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you.
Now, would you agree that you talk about this sort of argument that conservatives get sucked into this debate in the public sphere about spending, and in that way they kind of get sucked into a sort of argument over spending and sort of material understanding, similar to the case with marriage, where it's viewed more as a material benefit. You know, it opens up economic opportunity for the children as opposed to moral formation.
Yeah.
So would you agree then that sort of the issue here is that conservatives aren't able to have this debate about the soul, sort of, that, and I guess so. Would you agree with that? And if that's the case, how can this debate be changed towards that direction?
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. I think the terms of public debate in American life are set by the left much more than by the right, and that means that those debates are much more about money than they are about thriving, than they are about souls. I think part of that is our fault. Not all of it is, but certainly the part we can do something about first is our fault. And it's our fault in the sense that when we talk about things we shouldn't do, we don't put them in the context of what they make possible. So you can see that in marriage, you can see that in talking about poverty. We have to think about how the no is in the service of a bigger yes. And that yes really is human flourishing, right? It's a way of life that allows people to find genuine happiness together in community. That's what we're trying to sustain. That's what we're trying to make possible. That's why we care about marriage. That's why we care about the life questions. That's why we care about fighting poverty. And we don't say that enough. Instead, we talk about what we don't want to see more of in society, what there's too much of, what we need to stop. Or we talk about public spending, or we talk about, even when we talk about the breakdown of marriage, we don't talk about it in terms of what it is preventing people from having access to, what it is keeping people from. And what it's keeping people from is something that ought to be very attractive. And so even if you just think about it in terms of making a political argument, it would make for a much stronger argument if you talk about what the larger yes is in the service of which we have to say no to some smaller things. I think that's one place where we as conservatives don't do enough.
So how do you counter the argument that, you know, when somebody will say, you know, everybody's flourishing as their own, they have their own conception of flourishing? How do you combat that?
Well, look, in part that's true, right? But what is that conception of flourishing? What does it require? What does it involve? So sure, you can say people have the right in our society to define their own understanding of what happiness means, but the fact is most people come up with a definition that's pretty much like what most other people's definition looks like, and our society is doing a terrible job of allowing them to achieve it. So for what you want happiness to be, is our society, is our government doing the right things? It's not. It's almost certainly not. Some of that has to do with getting the definition wrong, but I think a lot of it has to do with thinking that the fact that people should have their own idea of human flourishing means that our society should have no common idea of human flourishing. I think without some common idea of human flourishing, there's no such thing as a society. And our society actually does have one. We just live our public life pretending that it doesn't. And that's crazy. And it's not just crazy, it's very damaging to a lot of people. That's what the index is full of, right? It's full of examples, of measures, of how the failure to devote ourselves to what is our common idea of human flourishing, in general terms, has real consequences in the lives of real people.
We need to make room for the next panel. I would highly encourage you to read Yuval's essay, and for that matter, pretty much anything he writes. He's written 2 other essays on this theme, one published in First Things about a year ago called The Long Road, and then an essay he contributed to a volume called A Room to Grow, as well as his book on Burke and Payne, to give you a richer, more nuanced, more human account of what conservatism stands for. Please join me in thanking Yuval.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuval.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Yuval, for that extraordinary synthesis of many, many themes that are important to this index and to our work here. We knew when we published the Index of Culture and Opportunity that it was important to track these 31 indicators over time. You measure what matters. But we also knew we could not stop there. We needed great thinkers like Yuval Levin to help us take a few steps back and integrate themes, synthesize these observations about our culture that are so critical to our diagnosis. I think we all gained things from Yuval's presentation there about how to better tackle our role in the policy world and in our civil society engagements, the ways that we serve our neighbors through community organizations. I'd like to invite the next set of panelists to join me here on the stage while I introduce them. Make it over there? Okay, great. Welcome. So our next panel is going to focus on the information in the index about welfare and poverty and education. And we've brought together a couple of the contributors and one of my colleagues here at Heritage to have this conversation together, and I'll be moderating with some questions. Before we jump into that, let me just introduce you to our friends here on the stage. Robert Woodson is the founder and president of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise. Over the decades of his work in that role, he has connected thousands of grassroots leaders, entrepreneurs at the neighborhood level who are helping to redeem lives, transform communities, and he has extraordinary stories to tell about that. He's also been a mentor to many of us here in the policy world, and I'm personally very grateful for that, Bob. Thank you. Anna Egalite, I'm so glad that we don't butcher the American, that's a lovely French name, and I'm so glad that we pronounce it French. So I'm glad I got to meet Anna today and hear the pronunciation from Anna of Egalite, and I'm so glad it's a beautiful name. Anna is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership, Policy, and Human Development in the College of Education at North Carolina State University. Before that, she was a postdoctoral fellow in the program on education policy and governance at Harvard University, and we were so grateful for her contribution this year to the Index of Culture and Opportunity. Lindsay Burke is the Will Skillman Fellow in Education here at Heritage, where she leads our efforts to advance parental choice in education and to curb federal intervention, which over the decades has not helped local schools, and she's doing a great job in that role. So I'm very pleased to have each of them join us here today. I'm going to sit and join them, and we're going to have a little conversation about these themes of welfare, poverty, human flourishing, and education. So Bob, let me begin with you, because I thought your, on the theme of diagnosing the problem correctly, your essay was very, very helpful in talking about the types of poverty that exist out there. And you particularly focused on that kind of poverty which is brought about by choices, Some kinds of poverty are not. They're beyond the reach and help of an individual. But sometimes it's the result of choices. And you have focused particularly on that in your work. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about that type of poverty and what kinds of successes you and those you work with have had in overcoming.
Well, as Senator Sessions said, when we were at the judiciary hearing, the minority had some people testifying, a young woman who was an abusive marriage, and she was left needing help. And she went on to get a degree, and I said to her, you cannot generalize about poor people. There are 4 categories. There are people who are just broke. They don't have any money. But their character's intact, and they use the welfare system the way it was intended, as an ambulance service, not as a transportation system. They use it as a bridge over troubled times. And then you got a second category of people who, like the mother in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who was a mother of a single mom and saved $5,000 of a welfare check to send her child to college, and she was charged with a felony. And so she concluded that, well, the disincentives are too bad, but she's of good character. The third category of people are physically or mentally disabled. We must find a way to. But the fourth category is the one that troubles most of us, and these are the people who are poor because of the chances that they take and the choices that they make. Theirs is a moral decision. Yes, I'm blaming the victim because they are to blame for their circumstance. But it also means that they're responsible for changing it. And so to just treat people in category 4 as if they're just need money, you disable them or injure them with the helping hand. People on the left tend to look at all poor people as if they're all category 1. People on the right tend to look at it as if they're all category 4. And we miss each other when we're trying to craft remedies. So the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, people who are filling our jails and are on welfare, or chronic welfare recipients, are category 4. And so it is essential then to address them, as Laval talked about, at the level of their problem. They must be challenged to change their values and understanding and their behavior and their attitudes. And what our groups do is precisely that. Challenges them successfully at the level of transformation and redemption is the first order of business before opportunity can be presented to them.
Now, when Yuval was talking about the importance of looking at the things that are going right, it reminded me of some things you've said over the years about the significance of looking at success and studying it rather than merely focusing on failure. This has been the focus of your work. It's been particularly a highlight in the Comeback series, the video series that's been done recently. Can you speak more about that and tell us a little bit more about the Comeback series as well?
Yeah, I think it's right. When liberals look at poor people, they see a sea of victims, and conservatives see a sea of aliens. And so they get missed. And so what we believe, and conservatives spend too much time chronicling the failures of people and not talking about, as Laval said, we spend so much time on the no and not explaining how that leads to the yes. And so it's important for what we do is to go in to low-income neighborhoods, and we look at the poor neighborhoods, and it's like the human body, that the sickest part of the body draws the strongest antibodies. And so it's the same with neighborhoods. And so therefore what we do is we go into neighborhoods, rather than looking for dysfunction, we try to find out who are achieving. Instead of the 70% of the families who are raising children that are dropping out of school in jail, we go to the 30% or not to try to find out why is their health there when it isn't among the 30%. They are the real sources of solutions. We ought to be concentrating our energies to talk about how people achieved against the odds and what is it, what characters of antibodies do they have that perhaps we can invest in and create an immune system that can spread to the other 70%. But we have to, first of all, believe that development is possible for people in order for you to do it. But if you're cynical, if you believe that if a person's had a bad start, they're from a drug-addicted mother who's had 3 babies by 3 different fathers, and therefore they're going to hell in a handbasket, if you believe that about them, then you don't talk about strategies of remoralization. I have met a lot of people who started life that way, who became remoralized later after they cleaned up their lives. They got married, they reclaimed their children from foster care, they have married and living successful lives. But we don't study people who have been in recovery from moral failure. But instead, we just assume that if you start life that way, then life is going to end that way. And that's why we're unable to address solutions.
One of the powerful things when you spend time with Bob is meeting the many friends that are in his life who are examples of having their lives transformed, and now they are helping others make the right choices as well. And that's documented in a new video series called the Comeback series in conjunction with Opportunity Lives, and I highly recommend that to you. They're short videos available online, all of them, and it just so inspires to watch these folks that have had their own, they've started making their own right choices and helping others to make that as well.
I tell people 80% of my closest friends are ex something.
That's great. All right, Anna, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. And of course, your work is educational research. You've focused quite a bit on the parental choice in education programs, places like Washington, D.C., and New Orleans and Milwaukee. What have you found about, as you studied these, what are your theories about? I'm going to jump to the conclusion. They're working pretty well compared to some other things. What are your theories about why that is?
So I'll start by proving that they are working for those people who don't have your faith. But we've had, a quarter of a decade now of school choice via vouchers and school choice via charter schools to really analyze the research evidence and get a sense of what's working and where there's weaknesses. And I would say that the sum of the evidence is quite encouraging. So in the case of school vouchers, the outcome that has been examined most extensively is student achievement. And there have been 12 random assignment studies comparing voucher winners to voucher losers in cities across the United States, in Charlotte, in North Carolina, in Washington, D.C., in New York City, in all kinds of places. And almost all of those, all bar two, find neutral to positive effects. And the two that didn't find positive effects, it's not that they found negative effects, it's that there were null effects. So in one case, in Washington, D.C., Patrick Wolf evaluated the voucher program here and raised some concerns about a loss of study power in the final year of the evaluation, which resulted in those null effects. It had found positive reading impacts in particular up until that point. But I would argue that we focus on achievement results maybe to our detriment sometimes. And so the more important outcome that I think any educational intervention should be measured against is, well, what about educational attainment? What about those critical milestones, high school graduation, college enrollment, persistence, and those things that we hope that high school students can make it to and through. And the evidence is also quite encouraging in that sense. So in terms of school vouchers, I can think of 3 studies in particular that would provide gold standard evidence on that measure. So in Washington, D.C., the students who received the vouchers just by random chance, by lottery, they graduated from high school at a rate that was 21 percentage points higher than the control group. So students who didn't get a voucher, they graduated at a rate about 70%, but those who received the voucher, their graduation rates were 91. So that is a significant difference in the lives of those students and sets them up for the next step and the next milestone after that. We may say graduation is not enough. What about the college step? And so evidence from Milwaukee suggests that students who received a voucher in that city, they graduated from high school at a higher rate, but they also enrolled in a 4-year college at a higher rate, and they persisted in college. And the difference in the treatment and the control comparison groups in that case was about 4 to 7 percentage points. And the final example I can think of is in New York City. So Paul Peterson and Matt Chingos have a study where they compare students who received the voucher at this point now years ago. And so we can look at, well, what happened? The world kept spinning. What happened to those outcomes? They found that for one particular subgroup, for African-American students who received the vouchers in New York City, their graduation and college enrollment rates were significantly higher. So I think those things are important to keep in mind. There are other outcomes that we might want to measure. I think that attainment captures sort of the sum experience of what we hope an education delivers. Yes, math and reading and science and social studies skills, but also the things that Senator Sessions talked about, so the development of character and resilience and drive. It's not easy, to get through those milestones, and you need the grit to do it. And there's something about these private school experiences that students have that are delivering those skills. And so I think that there is an important new direction in this area of school choice research where we need to be focusing on the measurement of those types of skills and comparing them between, students who have the opportunity to use a voucher or attend a charter school to see how they vary. But to get to the second part of your question, the why, the magic sauce, it was easy to answer the first part, right? Because I can just talk about the statistics. But the second part, I think that there are sort of three main theories that we can cling to and test them out and see how they are. And I'm not going to take credit for all of them. There are great thinkers who've been studying this type of stuff for a long time. But in the 80s, James Coleman proposed that the whole secret sauce behind what makes school choice successful, and he was talking about Catholic schools, but we could apply this to all types of private schools, is that they allow for the development of voluntarily constructed communities, and that in those communities people build trust among their networks, among parents and teachers and families, and that this leads to the development of social capital, and that is what strengthens those kids to make it to and through college. Another theory that Pat Wolf and I propose in our contribution to the index is this idea that parents have hidden knowledge about their kids, that they are right there, they're up close and personal, and they know the diverse strengths and the unique needs that their kids have. And so by giving them the power to satisfy their values and their preferences, there's a theory that, maybe they will choose the school that's the best fit for their child. So it may not look that it has the best test scores on paper or an A grade from the state. Parents value other things too, and that this is reflective of the things that they know about their kids. So there is a study in Louisiana that starts to sort of unpack this by Doug Harris and his research group, ERA New Orleans, where they examine parents' revealed preferences. So in New Orleans, you don't get assigned to any school anymore, public or charter or private. You have to go through the one-app system. And so they looked at, well, what are the things that parents value? Not just what they tell us, but what do they reveal in their choices? And yes, parents value test scores, but also they value things like proximity to their home, music, after-school programs, sports. And so I think that this is very reflective of the different values that different parent groups have. And choice is a way to put the parents in the driver's seat to allow them to exercise those values.
Wonderful. That's an extremely helpful discussion, and I hope we'll draw that out more as we turn to the audience for questions in a few minutes. I'll just share one anecdote that I think all of us have experienced here, as we've interacted with families who have had the opportunity to benefit from educational choice, where prior to that they had none, and they were assigned to an often failing and sometimes dangerous public school. Here in the District of Columbia, we just heard extraordinary testimonies from parents who were not like some other suburban parents maybe worried about the difference between a B and a B+. They were worried about their children coming home from school that day,
Right.
period, alive. And that allowing parents to put those priorities in order and to have a school where they can be just pretty secure in knowing that their child is not going to be in danger when they send them off is obviously a priority that comes before an exact grade point average. Mm-hmm. And that's what parental choice in education has allowed, for parents to rank those priorities. Once their child is secure, now let's begin focusing on those test scores. Then we're going to be focusing on graduation and getting you into a college. It allows them to order. So I really appreciate you raising that issue of fit and parents having hidden knowledge of their children. Mm-hmm. Well, Lindsay, turning to you, let's now turn to the other side of the equation, what hasn't worked so well. Public education policy, we've had reform after reform over the last few decades, and yet we're not seeing great results. Can you talk more about that and your theories on why?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for having me, and it's great to be on this panel. That was a really excellent overview, Anna. Thanks for doing that. And 2 points that you made that were so important, I think, and one that you just drove home, when we allow parents to make choices and to order their preferences, we often see them making very different choices than what maybe the state thinks they should be making. So really critical to enable them and to empower them to make those choices that they know are in the best interest of their children. And just to drive home that second point, that 21 percentage point increase in Washington, D.C., as a result of access to school choice and utilizing school choice, you would be hard-pressed to find any other education intervention that has produced those types of results. So it really has been dramatic and just a wonderful illustration of the power of parental choice in education. But to talk about what's not working and the inverse of all of that, we do have a public education system that has been heavily focused on debates about schooling and how we structure schooling and how we run public schools, and beyond that, about reporting to federal and state bureaucrats. And these are debates that are taking place about how we structure schools instead of how we ensure that education is actually meeting the needs of families, the way that Anna described it. And this misalignment really does stem from the fact that we have a public education system that has taken on the attributes of a monopoly. It's not a monopoly system, but it has many of the same attributes that we would attribute to one, instead of something that we have come to expect in every other aspect of American life, a wonderful market-based education system. The way we've set it up today, we build brick and mortar schools. We assign children, the government assigns children to those schools based on their parents' zip code, immediately disadvantaging children who are in low-income neighborhoods. And by extension, and critically, we have guaranteed schools dollars and students no matter how poorly they perform. They know that they will get a steady stream of dollars because parents have zero ability, in many cases, to vote with their feet. And as an extension of that, we have created a system where the incentive structure is completely out of whack and ends up favoring systems and bureaucrats within those systems as opposed to parents. This morning, I came across a story that really drives home this bureaucracy point in a sad way, I guess you could say. 2 schools in Minnesota have just hired, this is from this morning's paper, have just hired 2 recess consultants. Recess, you know, PE. So you've heard of the PC police, now we have the PE police. And this article out of Minnesota said that these schools are worried about the politics of the playground, and so they're taking an unusual step to police it. They've hired recess consultants. They argue that recess can be more inclusive and beneficial to children if structured, and if there are phrases like, hey, you're out, or replaced with good job and nice try, right? So, you know, you'll often hear, well, schools are lacking for resources, and if only we could put more money to our school system. And I would argue, and I think many of us on this stage would argue, that it's not about more money. It is about who controls those dollars and who's empowered to make decisions about where their children go to school and how those dollars are spent. But we continue to increase spending on systems instead of allowing those dollars to follow children to schools that work for them. So I think to a large extent, the need is diagnosed in education. Families need access to better options. The issue now is which school of thought will win out in the end about how we address those needs. We have one camp that says spend more money on systems, and another camp that says liberate those dollars and allow dollars to follow families to education options that meet their children's unique learning needs. And all of that second piece stems from a conviction that we need to put families back at the center of the policy process when it comes to education, and the absolute best way to do that is through school choice.
And there have been innovations on the school choice front to allow parents to be even more in the driver's seat. Can you talk about some of the latest developments there?
Absolutely. I've said this a million times now, but I wake up in the morning and think about education savings accounts, and I go to sleep at night thinking about education savings accounts, because they are such an innovation in how we deliver education dollars to families. If you go back to 1955, we saw, Anna mentioned vouchers earlier, we saw economist Milton Friedman first posit this idea of the school voucher, right? It was a novel idea at the time. It was sort of an academic, theoretical exercise at the time. And then we saw slowly but surely that model take hold. We saw it really unfold in 1991 in Milwaukee for the first time. In Wisconsin, we saw pockets of choice, primarily through voucher options. expand throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And in 2011, we saw a real explosion of school choice through both vouchers and tuition tax credit options, to such an extent that the Wall Street Journal called 2011 the year of school choice. We saw 12 states that year either enact or expand their private school choice programs. But what we saw over the past 4 years or so now, since 2011, has been a critical refinement of that original voucher model that Milton Friedman put forward back in 1955. And it started with Arizona in 2011. We saw Arizona kick it off, and Arizona said to families who are in the public system, if for whatever reason you want to exercise another option, you can have access to 90% of what the state would have spent on your child in that public school. That money actually goes onto a debit card that parents control, right? If we think about a voucher, which is a wonderful option, and we're very much all above on the school choice issue, but if we think about a voucher, it's basically a coupon to go to a particular private school of choice. And it's a great option, but that's sort of the extent of your flexibility. You pay your tuition, you go to your private school. With an ESA, parents get those dollars on a debit card. They can then direct every single dollar that's in their account to multiple education services and products and providers. So maybe they do a little private school tuition in the morning, maybe they hire a private tutor in the afternoon for an algebra course. They can purchase textbooks, curricula. The real innovation on the ESA front is that parents can roll over unused dollars from year to year. This is incredible. It's amazing. You can roll over your unspent money. You can even roll it into a college savings account. If you're in Arizona, you can put it in a 530 college savings account. So it gives parents every incentive not only to think about matching educational options with their children's unique learning needs, but also getting those ed options at a good price. And that's a big part of the reason why I like ESAs. They do put downward pressure on prices because parents have that incentive. I think I'm talking too much about dollars, but they do put downward pressure on prices. So that's a type of innovation we're seeing at the state level on the school choice question. I should say now 5 states have education savings accounts in place. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that Nevada, which became the 5th state this year to enact ESAs, did a nearly universal option. So every single child in a Nevada public school this upcoming year, if they choose, can have access to an ESA. So this is the first time we've ever seen a state do a nearly universal program. And the fact that Nevada went with the ESA route makes it that much more innovative.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lindsay. And Anna, we'll look forward to seeing you and Patrick and others measure those effects over time and just trying to capture those values that families bring to it. Bob, you have worked in and around schools for a long time. What effect have you seen parental choice in education having in lives?
First of all, I'm a very strong supporter of it. When Clint Bolick had argued before in Madison, Wisconsin, before the courts, in support of school choice, I had 2 busloads of parents from Milwaukee on that Saturday sitting in the audience, and every time Clint Bolick made a statement, they were shaking their heads in agreement. And the unions had 6 lawyers, and we prevailed. Having said that, I also, 9 years ago, persuaded the Bradley Foundation that it should convene some funders who support our interventions in the public schools. I say that it's important for advocates for school vouchers not to be perceived as being hostile to public schools. That's why the kind of pressure that is being applied to public schools is forcing some innovation in those schools. And so to that end, we have been operating for the past 9 years violence prevention efforts in 11 of the most violent schools in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We're able to reduce violence by 25% in 3 months by employing about 75 young adults who are from the community, who are moral mentors and character coaches to the kids. And as a consequence, the gang activity has been eliminated in Pulaski High School. Grades are up, and that's the same with all of the schools. We're now starting in Racine, Wisconsin. So I think it's important not to be perceived as against it, and that's why we should make investments. Most of the kids are in public schools. We should be concerned that they are able to thrive there as well. And it strengthens our hand to support vouchers and choice if we also say we're concerned about the kids who are in public school as well. That's a very key point, and that's why we're going to take our violence intervention program. We're in Dallas, Racine, Wisconsin. We're going to take it to Kansas City. We're expanding it because we think kids ought to be given the best chances regardless of whether in public, and our hand will be strengthened.
Anna, you want to
I
comment?
just wanted to say on that there's only, sometimes we forget because the conversations around choice programs can be so contentious,
Right.
that we're talking about a tiny percentage. So
Right.
350,000 kids, that's how many are involved in
That's right.
private school vouchers. Okay, a lot more are in charter schools, that's about 2.5 million. Put those two figures together, you're still talking about 6% of all
That's
public
right.
school kids. So the public schools certainly do play a role, and there are great public schools. And I think that in the long run, the biggest effect of these choice programs and this exit option
Make them-
is on the public schools and how it will change the incentives for them.
Yes, and already evidence is pointing that way, so it's good. We'd like to open it up to you now to ask questions. We'll have microphones coming around, so if you could raise your hand and identify yourself when you ask your question, one of our panelists. All right, we got a couple down here. 1 and 2.
Mr. Woodson, I was just curious, what's the name of this program that you've been doing in the schools?
Violence Free Zone. If you go on our website, cneonline.org, you will see it's called Violence Free Zone, where we actually go out and employ young adults. Many of them were troubled kids whose lives have been transformed and redeemed, and they are witnesses to kids. Just because life starts that way, it doesn't have to end that way. So that's the secret sauce in terms of transformation of people. I need to add that people are responsive more to to witnesses than they are an advocate.
And your formula there has really depended not just on the transformation of individual character, but also strategies that take on the character of the community.
Yeah, it's cultural change. See, a lot of these interventions on the part of well-meaning people, they have mentoring programs and whatnot, but they're still parachuted in. Or they recruit, they take care of refugees who are fleeing these communities. And caring for refugees is important. But you got to get into the source of the refugee problem. And it's in the community suffering it. That's why we believe that we, as one of my groups said, we invade the culture. We create within the culture islands of excellence that start and spread. And these are the antibodies that become an immune system, and that's where we need to invest so that we change the culture of the community from the inside out and the bottom out. That's why the word enterprise is in our name. In our market economy, only 3% of the people are entrepreneurs, but they generate 70% of the jobs because that's where the innovation occurs. But in our social economy, we ignore certification is more important to qualification than action. And we're trying to change it. We believe these grassroots leaders are social entrepreneurs with new and innovative ways to motivate and inspire people to undergo moral and spiritual transformation. And that's what it takes. So we need to harvest that. Researchers need to study success. And they don't do it.
Other questions?
My question is about the ESAs. What's the step beyond an ESA? Like, what's sort of on the horizon? Will it be in the arena of choice itself, or will it sort of hand the baton off to the development of schools or programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is another reason why I like ESAs, because we just don't know what the potential education system could look like down the road. We have no idea what possibilities it holds when you actually put parents in charge and allow them to drive decision making and drive the market of available schooling options. It is early, and we're in a pretty formative stage, particularly in Nevada, to know exactly what the supply side response will look like. Anna's done really important work on this, and I think New Orleans, Louisiana, is illustrative of what we don't want to have happen, which, as she mentioned, was a regulatory structure that has really been a reflection of what the state deems important and less what parents value in their children's educational options, so those revealed preferences. And the net impact in Louisiana has been a regulatory environment where many private schools worry about participating in their voucher program because of the regulations that are in place, and so only about a third are participating. So when we think about what school choice and what ESAs herald for the future, I think that how we structure accountability will be critically important to making sure that it can, in fact, become what we hope it becomes, which is every possible option that a parent could want is on the table and available and allowing for them to customize their children's education. So what it looks like moving forward, I think at this point is anybody's guess, but we do have early indications from Arizona and some of the other states that have done it. I'll give you one quick story. The Ashtons in Arizona are a great example of how families are using their ESAs. Max Ashton just graduated from Brophy Academy in Arizona. He has been legally blind since birth. And in 2011, when Arizona put their ESA option in place, his family decided to take advantage of it. And they said they were happy, relatively happy with their public school, but decided to go the ESA route. And so he uses his ESA. He attends Education Savings Account. He attends Brophy Academy. In Arizona, he pays for his private school tuition. See, I always do this. I swipe the ESA card. It's like old hat now. But he swipes his ESA card. He pays his private tuition at Brophy. And remember, this is 90% of just the state portion, right? So no federal, no local dollars. So he pays his private school tuition. He still had money left over to purchase all of his Braille materials, all of his assistive technology. And his dad, Mark, talks about how at the end of the day, after all of that private school tuition at what they say is the best private school in Arizona, his Braille, his talking computer, they still had money left over. They roll it over year to year. He just enrolled at Loyola Marymount University and is using his leftover ESA funds to pay his tuition there. So we have no idea what it will look like in the future, but man, when you put parents in charge, they can do some amazing things with those dollars.
And Lindsay, can I jump on there? Because you raised such an important question about we don't know what the future looks like. And so policy that's written today has to be flexible enough to accommodate that. And to give some credit to Louisiana, they do have a course choice program. And I wasn't aware of this, but half of public schools in Louisiana didn't offer a single AP course prior to the course choice program rollout. And through that, it's written quite flexibly. Families can access a public or a private provider. It can be online, or it can be blended learning, or it can be in person, and they can access those courses that way. And then I'll just draw your attention to, there's a really great article in Education Next today called What Next? And it's about alt schools and Summit Charter schools, and they're piloting this wearable technology for teachers to really track what's going on with students, and facial recognition software to monitor how well they're understanding a concept as they're learning it. And so we have no idea what direction we're going in, but it sure is exciting.
And you mentioned alt schools, and that made me think there are pop-up schools now and micro schools.
Yes.
We think about pop-up restaurants, now there are pop-up schools. We have no idea what it will look like, which is why we have to separate the financing of education from the delivery of services so parents can actually access all of those interesting options.
Anna mentioned the journal Education Next, which for those of you interested in education policy is a must-read for tracking and empirical evidence and the discussion about where education's going. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to, something occurred to me as Laval was making his presentation about moral formulation. That's a very important issue, and I think that and because most of our groups around the country, what really motivates them are the virtues of our founders. They are living examples of how they have taken the virtues of our founders and applied them to their life. With them, it's not an instrument they use in an argument to bludgeon the other side. It's fundamental to what they do in their path towards transformation. But a lot of religious conservatives have made it difficult to talk about the virtues of our founders because they have co-opted those and made it a part of even a political theme. And so what we believe we must do is decouple that from the discussion of the virtues, religion should be a pathway to understand and embrace those virtues, but it does not necessarily, the founders never meant for it to be a part of the religion. Am I right, Laval? Or I just don't think that, and so what we're trying to do at the center, we're equipping our activists to become knowledgeable about the founders so they can be the messengers. When you have somebody who works with ex-gang members and they're smart enough to articulate this, we need to equip them with the information so that they can come on and make presentations about the importance of the founding virtues. And there is a virtue, freedom. There are two kinds of virtuous freedom and libertine freedom. If you want to read something interesting, reading the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, he said he used to hate, in slavery, they used to really hate holidays because that's when the slave masters would ply the slaves with alcohol so that they could find freedom in terms of libertine freedom, freedom from responsibility as opposed to virtuous freedom that led some people who were born slaves but died millionaires. And so I think that it's important, at least from our perspective, again, to be redundant, that we must change the messengers for some of these messages when we're talking about culture and morality, moral reformulation. We've got to begin to expand the messengers to include the people who are employing them as in their strategy of restoration of their community and their lives.
Amen. I think virtuous freedom is a good note to close this program on. That is the goal of the Index of Culture and Opportunity and our Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity. So I want to thank Bob and Anna and Lindsay and Yuval and David, Senator Sessions, for having made this program so rich this morning. Please join me in thanking all our panelists.